Hey vinyl fans, welcome back up to the Vinyl Attic. We took a little break. We had some stuff happening. My dad came to visit. We had final exam grading. Now I'm finally getting to this on the Juneteenth holiday, a very important holiday, and we're trying to do this in advance of a heat dome that is heading our way. The planet is heating up, so we thought we'd talk about some hot tonight. We're finally doing, in our 100 records that must be in your collection, these are the 100 pieces of vinyl, the 100 long plays, LPs as we call them, that I think are special and are worthy of you putting some energy into putting them into your vinyl collection. We're finally going to talk about an album that is an essence of my teenage self. We're going to talk about the Ramones' 1980 album, End of the Century. Not the Ramones album that you might expect, like Rocket to Russia. That's the one everybody would want to talk about, or the Ramones' first album. 1980, produced by none other than Phil Spector. And we're going to talk about this record and why it's autographed by all the Ramones and PJ Souls. And so let me sort of set the stage for why this is the Ramones album I picked to really focus some energy on. The Ramones were an underground phenomenon coming out of CBGBs, and nobody really knew them. As a kid, reading rock magazines, let's say 1976, 1977, I'm reading Cream, I'm reading Hit Parader, I'm reading Circus Magazine. There's an article in Cream about a thing that's happening in New York called punk rock. And it talks about the CBGB's club. It talks about bands like the Ramones and Blondie and Talking Heads and all the bands that were playing. And it talked about how they were as close to the audience as you could be. And there was a picture of the Ramones, and Dee Dee Ramone was playing right up against the stage, and somebody in the crowd had their hand on his leg. I remember this very distinctly. I was going to concerts, in 1977, 1978, shows like Kiss, where you're a million miles from the band. There's no way of getting close to them. So the immediacy of punk rock, even before I knew what it sounded like, I knew what it looked like. And then when I heard the Ramones from an older kid in the neighborhood, I was like, this is pure rock and roll. This is the opposite of pop and disco. This is everything that I want. And by 1978, I was a hardcore Ramones fan. In fact, I was so hardcore Ramones that I sort of adopted their style, like the straight sort of beetly long hair, holes in the jeans, black t-shirts. People in my high school would call me Randy Ramone. That's how hardcore I was into the Ramones. And so in 1979, this was a band that was, wasn't easy to see. I saw them first in 1978 in Atlanta with the Runaways opening and a band called the Dynamic Atlanta Cruise-O-Matic. Then I saw them shortly after that opening for none other than Black Sabbath. With the very bottom of the bill was a new band called Van Halen. Van Halen, the Ramones, and then Black Sabbath. And people booed both Van Halen and the Ramones at that show. It was, I think, Halloween 1978. And then they played clubs, and I wasn't old enough to get in. They came to this place called the Agora to play quite often. That I ended up getting to see them in. But I was just so into this band as a kid. It was pop in a weird bubblegum way. The songs were goofy and fun about being a pinhead and being stupid and DUMB, everyone's accusing me. I mean, the music was funny and political and just completely opposite of Kansas and REO Speedwagon and everything that everybody else was listening to. And then in 1979, they put out a movie. Roger Corman produced Rock and Roll High School. And this movie played at something that was really big in the late 70s called the Midnight Movie, where radio stations would put on movies after the regular screening, and they would be like Pink Floyd at Pompeii or the Beatles' Let It Be. And we had a routine where on Saturday nights it was Rocky Horror Picture Show, which you had to go, if you're a punk rock kid in the late 70s, early 80s, you had to go to see Rocky Horror Picture Show. But on Friday nights, they always played Rock and Roll High School. And my parents, who wouldn't let me go to a club, would let me go see the Midnight Movie with my friends or sometimes by myself. Sometimes I would go to the movie. Sometimes I would sneak into the punk rock club in downtown Atlanta called 688. But the Rock and Roll High School was everything. It was this idea that rock and roll is going to save you. It starred PJ Souls as Riff Randall, the biggest Ramones fan. at Vince Lombardi High School, and she gets the Ramones to come and play at her school, and it was just great. It was just great. So the album that's sort of out at the time when the movie comes out is Road to Ruin, that comes out in 1978, and has a minor, not a hit like on Top 40 radio, but a minor song that plays on some rock and roll radio called I Want to Be Sedated. And then the movie comes out, and they get a much larger audience. And then in February, early February of 1980, a few weeks before my 16th birthday, this album comes out. And it sounds different. It sounds a little bit different. They kind of messed with the formula. All the albums at that point had been produced by Tommy Ramone, the drummer, who went on to be a kind of a successful record producer. And they brought in Phil Spector. Phil Spector had been trying to work with the Ramones for a while because they had this little kitschy 60s girl group sound that was mixed into the punk rock. I mean, there was this kind of early 60s element. And Spector had been trying to court the band. And then finally, in 1980, this album comes out. The recording of it is somewhat famous. So if you know Phil Spector, Wall of Sound, Ronettes, Be My Baby, and then he sort of ends the Beatles' career with Let It Be and works with George Harrison and John Lennon, these huge wall of sounds, My Sweet Lord, whole huge wall of sound. Righteous Brothers, You've Lost That Love and Feeling, wall of sound, like this, this kind of stuff that was meant to sound good on AM radio or on the jukebox was the hallmark of Phil Spector. Also, the hallmark of Phil Spector is the fact that he was nuts. He was insane, violent, problematic. The sessions he was working on with John Lennon in 1973, the rock and roll sessions, he apparently had a gun and was shooting the ceiling tiles out of the studio in Los Angeles. I mean, he's a volatile character. And the stories of making this record in 1979 were, at one point, apparently, first of all, he's a perfectionist. So, they're working forever to get a drum sound. So the sound of, the drummer hitting the drum over and over and over again until it's exactly right. But apparently at some point in the recording process, he held the band hostage at gunpoint because he wanted them to record the way he wanted them to record, to spend more time on it. He wanted to record Be My Baby, which they did on the album, one of his songs. And it kind of went off the rails. The result was something quite different. The album was recorded at Gold State Studios in Hollywood on Santa Monica and Vine, a famous studio where Phil Spector had worked on some of his classic records. The Beach Boys had recorded Pet Sounds and parts of Smile there. Hendrix had recorded there. Dylan had recorded there. Joan Jett and the Blackhearts recorded there. I mean, it was really sort of the Hollywood studio. Taking the Ramones out of their New York comfort zone. This band from New York City, so associated with New York City. And Rockaway Beach, right? I mean, that is about as New York as it gets. The album themes some of them were revisiting some characters. Jackie and Judy, Sheena make appearances, so we get to hear the stories of these characters that are featured on early Ramones records. There's a return to Havana, which is part of the political element of it. There's some discussion of drug use, because Dee Dee Ramone, the bass player, was a pretty serious heroin addict by this point. Chinese Rocks is a pretty heavy heroin song, and Be My Baby. But then there were two songs on it that were great singles that we actually started to hear on the radio. And this is before MTV. Rock and Roll Radio, which is so Phil Spector. Do you remember Rock and Roll Radio? John Lennon, T-Rex, and Al Muldy. But also a re-recording of the Rock and Roll High School theme song, which had only been available on the soundtrack record, which is a great soundtrack. It's never been put out on streaming or CD, as far as I know. I lived that record. It's how I discovered Eno and Nick Lowe and a bunch of other great artists, because they were on the Rock and Roll soundtrack, high school soundtrack. And so they're a bit of a wider audience. But it wasn't true to the Ramones form. So there was some mixed reviews when it came out. It doesn't sound like the Ramones we know. It sounds too much like Phil Spector. The next record they recorded in the following year, Pleasant Dreams, which was a classic. I mean, there's one of my favorite all-time Ramones songs is on that album. The KKK Took My Baby Away. I was hearing that living in the Klan town of Stone Mountain, Georgia, so how could I not love that song? So the story of Rock and Roll High School is, if you've seen it, oh, please, 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 it's just the greatest movie of all time, is that not only does Riff Randall get to meet the Ramones because he wants them to record her song Rock and Roll High School. She gets them to come to her high school, and they take over the high school, and spoiler alert, they blow it up with Principal Togar and a giant mouse screaming their lungs out. I mean, it is such the best teen. You couldn't make that movie now, post Columbine. You couldn't make a movie where the payoff is a bunch of kids in a punk rock band blowing the school up. But Riff Randall was kind of my idol. So in the process of all this, when the Ramones album first comes out, they do an in-store, which used to be a common thing back in the day at Peaches Records on Peachtree, the North Peaches. They did an in-store where they all came and signed the records. I actually took my entire Ramones collection, including Road to Ruin, and got them to sign it all. There they are. And then in the 21st century, I got to meet PJ Souls, and she signed it. PJ Souls, an honorary Ramone. I told her how I got called Randy Ramone in high school. But even better than that, I mean, meeting them was great. And Joey was eating pizza at the in-store, so there was that. Meeting them was great. But in 1984, when I was at Emory University, I was part of the committee to bring a band for the fall dance. And I was like, we got to get the Ramones. Can we get the Ramones? Let's get the Ramones. Let's get the Ramones. And the people that were in charge of booking it were like, the Ramones are available. They're affordable. Let's get the Ramones. So the Ramones played a private event at Emory University in the fall of 1984. And, of course, every punk rock kid and it was a Halloween ball. That was the theme of Halloween. So lots of people in costumes. Every punk rock kid is like, the Ramones are playing a private event and we can't see it. And I'm like, yeah, that sucks. If I was not me and helping to put on the event, I would find a way to sneak into the event. So what I did is I told all those punk rock kids, just come to the show. It's at a hotel in downtown Atlanta. Just come to the show and I will sneak you in. And I had like an underground railroad where I was sneaking all these kids into the Ramones show. And at first, the people that were running it thought they were just kids in Halloween costumes, that they were Emory students. But when the Ramones started and all those kids started slam dancing, I remember the dean freaking out, and they tried to stop the show at one point, and they would drag all these kids there. They'd say, "Are you an Emory student?" "No." Who are you?" "I'm a guest of Randy Blazak." Over and over and over again, all these kids. It was brilliant. It was chaos and madness, and just what should happen at a Ramones show. And the dean, who was not aware of slam dancing and punk rock and how you're supposed to act at a Ramones show, and all the administrators there were panicking. So the show's over, the Ramones are off the stage, and I hear an announcement, well, Randy Blazak, please come to the side of the stage. Because all these kids have been saying they were my guests. My lizard brain, fight, flight, or flight, kicked off, and I just hopped on my Vespa scooter and rode away. But the following week, I was pulled into the dean's office at Emory and threatened with suspension of college. And all I could say was, the Ramones, what did you expect? you hired the Ramones, and you are shocked that you saw this chaos? It's the Ramones! And I managed to talk my way out of being suspended from college. But it was my Riff Randall moment, and I'm so proud of that. This record is really great. It's sort of a testament to the last bit of Phil Spector's career. As many of you probably know, in 2009, he was found guilty of the murder of a young actress in his house, shot her at fairly close range, and was sentenced to a life in prison. He died of COVID in 2021 in prison, and it's sort of a sad ending to this madman who's behind so many brilliant records that are just the soundtrack of the 20th century. So this one has that tension. This one has that madness to it. It's the Ramones, it's Phil Spector, it's Rock and Roll High School, it's the end of the century, it's the end of the 70s, and it is a brilliant picture of life on the edge. There you go, end of the century. It was the best charting album of any Ramones album. It hit 44, I think, on the album chart on Billboard. So, it's the one that you think it's the attention and the recesses of our memory, but usually we go to things like Road to Ruin and Rocket to Russia. But end of the century, I love it. It's so Spector. Next time, we're going to stay in a similar vein. We're not talking about punk rock, but we're going to talk about the Rolling Stones. And there's a zillion Stones albums we should talk about. We're not going to talk about the ones that you expect. We're going to talk about an unexpected album that is really important in the canon of the Rolling Stones. And I think it's about time in our top 100 albums that we get to a Stones album. So let's do that. But in the meantime, the Ramones, I mean, you know, the Ramones are now music in commercials. They're using Ramones in, like, Toyota Camry commercials. And the Ramones is the backdrop for, like, a Juicy Fruit commercial. It's sort of sad what's become of their legacy and how they were connected to such a small group of misfits in America during this period. That there was just a small group of us weirdos who didn't connect to anybody else. But through the Ramones, we had something that we could connect to. And I think Cream magazine and Circus magazine and Hit Parade and all the rock magazines that told me about punk rock. And I thank the Ramones for liberating me from my small town, KKK town. And this record allowed me to live out my dream of being the Riff Randall of Emory University. So the Ramones matter. All gone. Tommy's still with us, but the rest of them are all gone. The Ramones matter. This album matters. This music matters. You matter. So let's talk about it.